Welcome back. We're going to talk about, we're going to shift to the Pacific theater for this lecture. I want to talk about Hiroshima and the atomic bombing that took place over Japan in August of 1945. I remember, I think it was back in 1995, I believe Bill Clinton was president. The curator of the Air and Space Museum on the mall there in Washington, one of the most popular tourist attractions there on the mall, announced a new exhibit. What they were going to do is take the Enola Gay, that's the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the atomic bomb. Pilots will often name their airplanes for their girlfriends or their wives or their mothers. And Paul Tibbets was the pilot of this on this mission that dropped the bomb, and he had named his plane after his mother. So there on the side you can see Enola Gay. So the Air and Space Museum announced that they were going to get the Enola Gay out of mothballs and shine her up and make her the centerpiece of a new exhibit. Accompanying the plane itself, there would be on one wall a series of photographs taken in the city after the atomic bombing, and these were, pretty horrific. If you've seen these photographs, you see people on fire. You see people with their skin peeling off as if they were a piece of fruit. You see people jumping in the river, and of course the river's on fire too. Buildings obliterated. Just like I said, just horrendous images. And then on the other wall, accompanying the Enola Gay, would be artifacts from the city, just everyday human artifacts, wristwatch, bicycle, things like that. So the tourists could come in to the Air and Space Museum. They could examine the Enola Gay. They could look at the photographs of the city and what the atomic bomb had done to the city and to the people. And then over here, they could look at the common everyday artifacts collected from the city after the bombing. And I remember there was just a national firestorm over this announcement. The conservative groups in particular said, you cannot do this. It's treasonous to display these photographs and these artifacts. It's un-American to do so. The conservative right-wing groups in particular were incensed at this idea. And this became just a genuine political controversy. It was on the front of all the news magazines. It led the evening news on television. Congress got involved. The president got involved. In the end, as I recall, because of the protest, the plans were scrapped, or at least changed. And it seems like the curator of the Air and Space Museum ended up resigning. Don't hold me to that, but I believe that's true. So you can see that history is not it's not irrelevant, and it's not even past. You can still get a fight started over Hiroshima. Now, at the time this occurred, I remember reading about it in the paper, and I was a little baffled by it. I kept thinking, why are the conservative groups so angry that we would show the effects of the atomic bomb? I mean, we have the plane right there as a centerpiece of this exhibit, right? And presumably we know we're not dropping rose petals and potpourri from this plane. We're dropping an atomic weapon that's going to destroy a city and kill many thousands of people. So, as the controversy raged, it became apparent that there was perhaps a lingering sense of shame or guilt that the United States had done this. I remember reading Secretary Stimson. Henry Stimson was the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, and I remember he said something to the effect, as he contemplated the use of these atomic weapons, that he didn't want to get into an atrocity contest with Hitler. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into why this remains a very controversial topic in history. What I want to do here is to talk about the options presented to President Truman in the summer of 1945. You'll remember FDR dies in April 1945 down at Warm Springs, Georgia, at the little White House. Truman is suddenly president of the United States. I think he said it felt like the sky had fallen in on him, just the crush of responsibility, suddenly becoming president. And of course, for many people, FDR, it seemed like he'd been president forever. He'd been elected to his fourth term just a few months earlier. Nevertheless, Truman is presented with options to end the war against the Japanese. Truman becomes president in mid-April. The Nazis surrender, I think, the first week of May. So the war in Europe is over. Yet we still have the Japanese to contend with. So the military option is presented to the president, and it's not a very pleasant option to contemplate. It has two basic parts. Number one, we're going to have to invade the Japanese islands, and considering the tenacity with which the Japanese have fought all the way across the Pacific, defending these worthless volcanic islands, fighting to the last man, mass suicides instead of surrender, just a brutal, horrific war in the Pacific. The idea is, of course, if the Japanese are going to fight this hard for these worthless tips of volcanoes, imagine how they're going to fight to defend the home islands. Presumably every man, woman, and child will be armed, and there will be a mass slaughter on the beaches outside of Tokyo. So this is a most unappetizing prospect. Now, the second part of the military option includes the Soviet Red Army coming in against the Japanese in Manchuria. And Roosevelt, of course, had extracted this promise from Stalin at their last meeting at Yalta back in February of '45. Stalin had promised President Roosevelt that indeed 3 months after the war in Europe ended, that he would bring the Red Army in against the Japanese and help us finish them off. So that's option number one, and like I said, it's a very intimidating option because of the sheer casualties that are projected. I don't know, I've heard all kind of numbers that were given to the president regarding U.S. casualties, and some of them are outrageous, but the casualties in invading Japan would probably be the worst of the war. I think we can agree on that. Now, there's another option, that's a diplomatic option, and it's ruled out. The diplomatic option says, look, the Japanese know they're defeated. There's word in the diplomatic circles that the Japanese know this and that they will contemplate surrender under the right conditions. This diplomatic option is rejected because just before the U.S. entered the war, President Roosevelt met with Prime Minister Churchill, and they published what's called the Atlantic Charter. Now, in this Atlantic Charter, it says that the Allies will only accept unconditional surrender from the Nazis or the Japanese, that we will not negotiate with them, we will not make concessions to them, unconditional surrender. The Japanese, like I said, have made it known now in the spring and summer of '45 that they are contemplating surrender. But on one condition, they get to keep the emperor. And the Japanese relationship to the emperor is, it's hard for Westerners to get their head around. One analogy I can think of is the Egyptian Pharaoh in antiquity, the Pharaoh having a sort of semi-divine status, and the Japanese emperor has this and is exalted by the Japanese people. But Truman and the leadership of the Allies determined that we cannot afford to politically make concessions to the Japanese. So the diplomatic option is ruled out. There's other talk about a demonstration, maybe exploding an atomic weapon off the coast of Japan so the Japanese can see what they're in for. This is also discarded. Now, there's a third option suddenly emerges in late July 1945. Truman is actually, I believe he's at Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin. He's meeting with Churchill and with Stalin. This is the last meeting of the big three. And Truman gets word that the Manhattan Project is a success. The Manhattan Project, of course, is the code name for the United States efforts to build an atomic weapon. This had begun in the early 40s. I believe a group of physicists had written a letter and had Albert Einstein sign the letter, knowing that this would get attention since he was quite famous. The letter was sent to President Roosevelt, and essentially it said that the Nazis are working on an atomic weapon, and that if Hitler gets this first, he will undoubtedly use it, and that it would behoove the United States to begin work on such a weapon. So Roosevelt kickstarts this effort, and billions of dollars are poured into it. Entire cities are built around it, originally in Los Alamos, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where the smartest men in the world, the greatest physicists in the world, are brought to work on this problem of how to create an atomic weapon. Now, finally, this is tested. I think it's called the Trinity Test, and it's successful. And Truman receives word of this, and of course, this is like having an ace up your sleeve, isn't it, in a poker game. I remember Truman sidling over to Stalin and mentioning to him that we have this new weapon of devastating consequences. And I believe Stalin says something to the effect that he hopes that the United States makes good use of it. So we have, suddenly we have three options now, don't we? A diplomatic option, which we've rejected, a military option, which now may not be necessary because of this atomic bomb. I'm going to stop there. There's a few more things that I want to say about Hiroshima, some conclusions, and some explanations that scholars have put forward. And we'll do that next time. Thank you.